Welcome to a special episode of Love You Like Crazy. Normally, my co-host Carrie and I talk about young adult books, but these special episodes contain discussions I had with people I talked to at PodX. One thing they have in common with our normal episodes is that they may contain spoilers for the books we talk about, and a few might contain the odd swear. With that understood, on to the episode! Now I'm talking to LeBreton, who is a Brooklyn-based actor and playwright, performs in the New York neo-futurist weekly show The Infinite Wrench, and is the voice of Michael Whitten in Season 3 of Within the Wires, which is where I know you from.
Amazing. I'm so delighted to hear that you enjoyed the show.
Oh, it's great. It's really, I would say, my favorite sort of scripted fiction podcast. It's just like so inventive in its form, and then, all the seasons I've just have really been psyched about.
Amazing. That's so lovely to hear. Because each season is sort of a standalone thing, and I wasn't involved in seasons 1 or 2, I feel less self-conscious about being such a huge fan of seasons 1 and 2. The first season that I started with, season 1, is one of my favorite pieces of audio fiction. As soon as I talked to Jeffrey about working on the project, I went and listened to that, or finished rather. I'd started listening to it. I went and finished that first season. I was like, oh yeah, I really want to be involved in this.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar with it, the first season is, it's sort of a work of fiction that takes the form of a series of relaxation tapes. Mm-hmm. And it's set in this dystopic future. And it sounds like that shouldn't work at all. It sounds like the worst, well, maybe not the worst idea. It sounds like a really bad idea, but it's just done so well, and the way that that it's pulled off is so great. And then in the most recent season, which you are the star of, it's like dictaphone tapes, I guess, or voice memos from a government bureaucrat to his underling or executive assistant. Is that?
I think Michael might call her his secretary, which is, a word that we don't tend to use because if it's, I believe because it has a sort of like awful mid-century sexist baggage to it. Mm-hmm. I think Michael, you know what, I should know that, but I think he calls her his secretary. Yeah.
Amy, have you ever heard of espresso? It's disgusting, and I love it. Maybe introduced me to this stuff at a place called Gianni's on Halsted.
One of my favorite moments is when Michael is penning a letter to someone of a higher station than him, and makes mention of his staff, which is such a subtle power play because there is only one member of his staff, but he doesn't necessarily want the other person to know that. It's me talking to Amy, my assistant, and it has a more like noir flavor than the previous 2 seasons. It was really fun.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing is that there's sort of the form, but then there's the genre, which is different each season. So like season 2 is kind of a mystery.
Yeah. It's like this fun psychodrama.
That takes out through those tapes that you play when you go to an art gallery, and it tells you what's.
Yeah, the museum audio guide gone rogue, I guess is the frame.
But anyway, I brought you here to talk about books, and specifically YA books, or books that you read when you were yourself a young adult. So is there a particular book or author that comes to mind?
I was thinking about what I was reading as a young teenager, specifically because I was a young teenager in like the late 90s, early 2000s, which was such a heyday for young adult fiction, and was firmly in that time period where young adult fiction was leaning very hard into darkness and like imagining like sort of like cyberpunk dystopias. I was a huge fan of Madeleine L'Engle. I know you've talked about Wrinkle in Time before on your show. I went back and spied. I was thinking about Madeleine L'Engle's works. They were so appealing to me as somebody who grew up in a very religious community, and that sort of that sort of imaginative spin on the Christian worldview, which is something I have a lot of personal distance from now, but was so engaging to me as a young person. And there's a specific one that got stranger the more I remembered from it, and it was Many Waters, which is the one that falls in the, I believe it's called the Time Quartet, that follows the Murray family.
Mm-hmm.
So there's Meg and Charles Wallace, who are the central characters of Wrinkle in Time, who are a little bit more like well-known figureheads of the series. But then they have these twin brothers, Sandy and Dennis, who are sort of like tertiary characters for most of the series. They're like the normal ones. They play sports. They're very smart. One of them wants to be a doctor. One of them wants to be a lawyer at 15, which I find kind of hilarious. And they sort of exist on the periphery as like holding down the fort of normalcy in this very unusual, gifted family. And then in Many Waters, you actually get to meet them, and they're the focus. They spend most of the book apart, which is really interesting. So there's less of the like two twins versus the world narrative, and it's much more about them trying to be reconnected. But the book is beautiful and deeply, deeply strange, and like sort of unexpectedly sensual for a book intended for a young adult audience. There's they're in the desert, so it's a lot of like, like sweating and running and being in like close quarters inside of a tent, which the more I went back and thought about it, I was like, what the hell? Madeleine, what sort of like, what were you working out there? The basic premise, which I think you are already familiar with, is that the parents of this family of children are scientists. They do a lot of work in space, like tampering with space time, basically. And the sort of MacGuffin of the book is these two twins blundering home from ice hockey practice, and they're looking for snacks because they're teenage boys, I guess. And they barge into their parents' lab and tinker with a computer. And what they interrupt is a time travel experiment, and they get transported to a desertous place in prehistory that they gradually realize is the time of Noah, and the flood is coming up, like a biblical Noah. And in this world, angels still walk the earth, and there's mammoths and things like that. So they become trapped. They could become trapped in the past and separated on different oases, and then have to find their way together. And then they have to find their way home back to their own time before this world-ending flood comes. Or they're stranded on Noah's Ark, which they help build. That was the other thing. There's a lot of like manual labor in the sun. So many things. And the other sort of like thematic arc is that the twins are sort of in disbelief the whole time they're in the past that this could possibly have happened, or that these beings that they're encountering are actually angels or like celestial beings of some kind, because they're very they have these sort of like scientific minds. And there seems to be a theme of them accepting things that they can't see or rationalize. This sort of like faith-based things, which was interesting to come out as. That was very, very much part of the language and the worldview of the community that I grew up in, and is less so now. It was funny to reflect back on it and to sort of revisit some chunks of the book and see how overt that like Judeo-Christian worldview was in the writing of it. That was just sort of like already in the air when I was reading it as a young adult, and didn't necessarily pick up on as such. Yeah,
I haven't read that book recently, but I read that whole series as a kid, and that was definitely because I was raised not religious, and so I tended to, like, when there was religious stuff in books, I just tended not to recognize it. So like, I read the Narnia books, and at some point someone was like, those are Christian allegory. I was like, what? Really? Reading it now is like, could not be more obvious.
Right.
But in the Wrinkle of Time books, you know, particularly by the time I was at that one, I was like, okay, so it's like kind of about science, but then there's Noah's Ark. What is going on?
Right.
And yeah, I remember that one was very confusing to a young me.
It was confusing to me now as somebody with a lot of like, it's like biblical fan fiction in a way. And the spin on like what angels are. I also had a very funny moment when I was looking back. I was like, something about the way those angels were described was really like strange and stood out to me really vividly. And I went back and read a few passages. And the first time Dennis, one of the twins, encounters one, it's an enormous, completely androgynous winged figure who like picks him up when he's in distress and lays him on a soft bed of moss or whatever. And I was like, oh, I guess I'll need to bring that up in therapy on Tuesday or something, because there's all kinds of things swirling around in there. But that's not something that's part of like a normal that's not something that came up in Sunday school, that angels are these like towering, strange, incomprehensible figures necessarily. You know, much more common was the idea of them being like gentle, glowing, winged people who mostly sang and played harps and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, Madeleine L'Engle definitely had like a worldview of her own that she was very specific about and was not gonna soft pedal in the books.
No, there's no dialing it back. In fact, I believe it's a series where it dialed all the way up until eventually there's like a ritual sacrifice at like a druid henge or something like that in an appropriate time, which so it was just all uphill from there.
Yeah. Wow. Maybe I do have to read that again.
Yeah, revisiting it.
Yeah. I mean, and the Wrinkle of Time movie came out, was that last year? Everything.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And like, there are certain things that I felt like I could understand why they got left out, because they weren't really cinematic at all. Like, there's a fair section of the book that takes place on a planet that is completely covered in fog and and inhabited by blind creatures. And I'm not exactly sure how you would film that in a way.
Yeah.
But it's such a great part of the book. And I remember, I think Mrs. Beast or something. There's
right. Yeah. Yeah. Is that where they meet Aunt Beast?
Aunt Beast. Yeah. That's what it is. Yeah. And there's also, she like cradles Meg, and that's, it's just such a shame that couldn't be in the movie, because that is just such an appealing, that whole thing is just so appealing and so great.
Yeah. Weirdly, I have a really vivid, like, I guess it's not a tactile memory because I wasn't actually touching anything, but the thing that I remember most from that chunk of the book was, again, Madeleine L'Engle's really intense attention to like the body and like textures and things like that. Like that's something that comes up a lot in Many Waters too. Yeah, what an interesting like thematic link. That's what I remember from that chunk of Wrinkle in Time really clearly. Yeah. What a shame that I don't know how they would have put that in the film, but what a shame. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, and I mean, you saying that makes me sort of think about because so much of the stuff is so abstract, like time travel, the Tesseract, which you can't even really picture in your brain at all. And then it's combined with all this tactile stuff. Just what an extraordinary brain put all that together and made a book that people still read, however many years later.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I was sort of like astonished to remember or have come flooding back when I was to walk it back a little bit, I went and found a digital copy of Many Waters when I was like, I think that might be what I want to talk about, was the sort of the clunkiness of the setup. There seemed to be a bizarre mismatch between the attention paid to the world building of like the prehistory world and of like Noah's world, because there's a lot right out of the gate about like, this is how their language works. This is a very clear if not particularly sophisticated, but very clear explanation for why they're able to communicate and how this desert community manages resources. But the again, that MacGuffin of getting the twins to and from the past reminded me of like weaker Star Trek episodes where there's like it happened very quickly. We just sort of needed to involve a computer, which is, it's like the 60s, so it's sort of mystifying. So as long as if somebody taps a button on a computer, there was an assumption that like we'll just sort of go with like the computer was very powerful and was definitely able to open a rift in space time. And reading it now in 2019, we're like, what? That was one hell of a keyboard. Like,
yeah.
What sort of tech were we working with, really? And that was it was strange at how clunky the exposition was laid out, and also sort of delightful. I mean, there's certainly Star Trek episodes that I adore where the device used to get somebody, trapped in the holodeck or whatever is extraordinarily weak. But, by 10 minutes in, I don't care. I'm just glad they're being Robin Hood or whatever it was. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan.
I was a big Next Generation person. And then I watched Deep Space Nine and a little bit of Voyager. And then, basically I moved to New Jersey and kind of lost my Star Trek social group and sort of fell off the wagon at that point.
Yes. Yeah.
But I did go back and watch a bunch of the Next Generation a couple of years ago. And a lot of it still fun. But yeah, and Doctor Who is probably even more guilty of this, where they're just like, okay, so here's where we want to go. So don't pay too much attention to this first part. It's just to get us to the fun stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So reading it now, you find things in there that you weren't conscious of when you read them the first time around. Do you think that these are things? How do you relate to it differently as an adult than as?
Oh yeah. Because that's absolutely the process that I was going through when I was revisiting it. I was really surprised in a lovely way at how much the poetry of it still affected me. That scene that I described with the where one of the seraphim rescues one of the twins, or I think maybe he's already rescued, maybe he's just being cared for in that moment, was very, very viscerally moving. And I was sort of delighted how effective the poetry of that scene and a few of the others that I revisited still was. And that's a really nice feeling to know that something that felt vast and exciting and beautiful, even when I was a young person, can still make me feel that way as an adult, 15-ish years later. It was a little unnerving to realize the extent to which, like, the religious worldview that I was raised in was baked into media and books and stories that I thought of as totally separate. That's a strange feeling to feel like, oh, perhaps my world was a little bit smaller and a little more carefully curated than I was aware of when I was a young person. That can feel a little unsettling. But again, there's something about there's something about the weirdness of Madeleine L'Engle's worldview that is really exciting and is one that I'm glad I, if I was going to read a series of books that provided a lot of sort of a confirmation bias of a lot of information that I was hearing, I'm glad at least it was one where there were like weird beasts and like time travel and things like that. And ones where like androgynous angels were running around and interacting with mammoths and things like that. So there's something unsettling. And also I was sort of like, oh, I'm glad I was reading this when I was a young person. I wondered also how many young people are still reading this book series. I mean, by now, in the 90s, it was absolutely very common to go get your summer reading from the library. And just by virtue of libraries stocking a bunch of older books, or making older books really accessible. It was just so common for people to stumble across young adult fiction from the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I'm actually not sure if that's how if young people find their reading, just because we live in a digital age. I have no idea how much they're accessing young adult fiction from, the mid 20th century.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I feel like, so when I was growing up, I was a total bookworm, and I would just go to the library and check everything out that I possibly could. And one of the things that I would like of the books that are important to me, and this has kind of been true of other people that I've talked to today and yesterday. Like one of the strong sense memories that people have is of the cover, and the cover of the editions I had of those books were likewise very strange and distinctive. But today, with the rise of ebooks, I don't know if that's necessarily what people think of first when they think of a book. Well, that wasn't really a question, but
no, that did give me a really visceral emotional reaction. The idea that somebody would not form an emotional relationship to the cover of the book they were reading. Because I grew up with the same thing of those covers are so saturated with memory and emotion, especially in the feeling of where you were when you read them. There's a bunch of Mary Higgins Clark books that I so strongly associate with sitting next to a pool in a really hot summer in Texas, because that's when I read them. And likewise, the cover of those Wrinkle in Time books, or the Madeleine L'Engle Time Quartet books, there was an edition that had these sort of strange, very thin-lined illustrations that sort of framed the book title. And then there was another one that looked sort of like the very not stereotypical, but the very common young adult. They're trying to be photorealistic. It's sort of like a collage of the main characters of the book, and then some iconic scenes or objects or whatever. And both of those, I must have not read them all for the part of the same edition, because I have emotional memories with a bunch of those different styles of covers. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And then there are a bunch of people who encounter them first through the movie now. Interesting. Which I did like the movie. Although, well, I don't know. That's a whole other discussion. Did you see it though?
I didn't, you know what? I didn't see it, and I was shocked that it wasn't a higher priority for me. Because that book had meant because Wrinkle in Time specifically had meant so much. That was part of a period when I was attaching really heavily to Meg Murray and Hermione Granger and all of the other bookish, bookish nerdy girls and things like that. And
the best characters.
I know, right? Yeah, they had a really good. They had an awesome heyday. I mean, still do the best characters. And I was sort of surprised that I sort of let it drop down my priorities list, especially because I love so many of those actors that they got in the film. Yeah, what a strange thing to think that that's some people's first introduction to that book series.
Are there other things that we should talk about with this book that haven't come up yet? This is me kind of abdicating my responsibility.
Absolutely. No. Well, I mean, it's such asking someone to talk about a formative young adult fiction book is such a personal, I can imagine it's hard to know where that person's journey will go.
I mean, something that I might say is just that, I don't know, kind of the concept of sort of sneaking things into the book, right? So there's the Christian stuff, which sort of fit in with your upbringing. And then there's this other stuff, which is also super intriguing. It kind of seems like you are, I don't know, disappointed or unhappy that you didn't see the Christian themes in there earlier, but I feel like maybe that's why that's sort of how it all works. You know, it's part of the development.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there is something really lovely about there was a pretty obvious intention that on Madeleine L'Engle's part, I gather, that I connect this journey of the twins towards accepting and embracing the existence of celestial beings and the specific version of God. There is also that storyline that is very like personally valuable to me still today of that I'm glad I encountered as a young person of there's going to be things in your life that you won't be able to rationalize. And leaning into those things can lead to wonderful other things happening. There's going to be things that challenge your your belief system and how you interact with people and what you think is possible. And in that sense, I really value that thread of the book. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that.
That just seems like such a good place to end. But
absolutely. I'm down. Yeah, down to end there. I will say I've been skimming an ebook version of it, like a sort of like truncated ebook version of it. And now when I get back, I am absolutely going to the Brooklyn Public Library and getting the full version.
Excellent.
It's like, I think there's more to mine here. I want to go back and see what else has just sort of been hanging out in my subconscious all these years and what else is logged in the memory banks.
That's so great.
Yeah.
I feel like my work here is done.
Yeah, you did a great
I did it.
job getting more people to read good fiction.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent. So I gave you sort of the abbreviated introduction at the beginning. I don't know if there's any other things that you want to plug or say about yourself at this point.
Sure. You can listen to me as the voice of Michael Whitten on season 3 of Within the Wires, which is part of Night Vale Presents. I will also be making an appearance in The Strange Case of Starship Iris. Hilariously, playing another person working at a desk and having misgivings. That seems to be my brand now. And I'm also a New York neo-futurist, and I perform several weeks out of the year in downtown downtown Manhattan. So if you ever want to see me live rather than just listen to the sound of my voice, you can catch me performing with the Neos in the Infinite Wrench.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been lovely.
Oh, good. Yes, I think it's been lovely too.
Give me a call when you get back. Hey there.
Hey.
LoveWhiteLikeCrazy.com